Well, hello, I'm Elizabeth, as Michelle said, and I am really happy to be out. This is, I gave birth about a month ago exactly, and this is one of my first times out in circulation in the public, and awake and out of my pajamas, so I am really happy to be here, and my husband says to say hello. He was sorry he couldn't be here, but he's with little Peter George right now, and keeping him entertained, so I appreciate you guys having me back to chat a little bit. I see some people that I know, so it's good to be here. So as Michelle said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about maintaining healthy boundaries. And I'm going to talk in particular a little bit about maintaining healthy boundaries in friendships with the opposite sex and also while dating too. So a little background, a little bit about me and how this pertains to my story. I grew up not Catholic. I grew up in a home that was kind of culturally Christian. So there wasn't a lot of talking about treating members of the opposite sex as brother and sister, et cetera, et cetera. That was something that was a totally new concept to me, for sure, and was never something that was talked about. In fact, I had all brothers growing up and all male cousins, and so I very honestly was mostly more comfortable with male friendships than with female friendships. I found female friendships to be drama-filled, to be honest with you, and just not as enjoyable. I felt that the guy friends that I had were more fun to be around. They were more honest. They were more down to earth. I just felt more comfortable with guy friends. So largely because of that, in high school, the pattern that I sort of personally fell into was, and I've had female friends for sure. My best friends probably were female, but I did have quite a few male friends. And what I started to notice in myself is that I would have this pattern of being good friends with a guy until the point when either he or I would have feelings that would change from friendship to something more than friendship. If any of you have ever seen the movie When Harry Met Sally, I don't necessarily advocate the holiness of that movie, but there are some pretty funny parts. But one of the classic lines is men and women can never really just be friends because one or the other of them always ends up being attracted to the other person. And I very much fell into that with most of my male friendships. So what happened in my own life was that I would often, I would date some of these guy friends for, the high school 48 hours or anywhere up to to a couple months. And I was very, very blessed, even though I didn't know the Lord at that time. He really took care of me and protected me. I didn't have a lot of physical baggage, praise the Lord, out of those relationships, but I had a lot of emotional baggage of getting involved with guys emotionally, sharing these deep, personal things with them, and then having these relationships not work out. And I didn't realize until after the fact how much I gave my heart away to guys in that way. And it was a pretty big thing for me. So fast forward a little bit, I went to school at U of M, go Blue. And my first year there, I'm an elementary music teacher, or was in my past life, pre-baby. But I was in the School of Music, and I got to be good friends with a guy there who ended up becoming my best friend, actually, at U of M. And we got to be very, very close. And at the same time that we were getting to be close, we were both getting into our faith, actually. He was someone that had grown up Catholic and fallen away from the church. And I was just in the process of getting interested in the church, and I'm a convert coming into the church. And so there came a point in our friendship where it became very obvious that neither one of us was ready to get married. And because neither one of us was ready to get married, what we would go into this habit of was waffling back and forth between, are we just friends? Are we more than friends? Are we, going back and forth in this ebb and flow. And it was emotionally exhausting and not healthy. And it was a very painful thing in my life. I was ready to move forward and to pursue getting married, I thought, but he was definitely not. And because I didn't put some of those boundaries in place, and he didn't either, we ended up getting pretty emotionally attached to each other, and not a good way that was very healthy. So praise the Lord, around our sophomore year at U of M, we got introduced to a Christian group on campus called University Christian Outreach. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it or not. UCO, woohoo. So one of University Christian Outreach's great blessings of formation, Father John Ricardo actually went through University Christian Outreach, so if you ever want to talk to him, a large reason that he is the way that he is because of some of the formation from this group. But they really advocate, one of their strongest things is they really advocate setting healthy boundaries in male and female friendships and looking at the opposite sex as brothers and sisters. I had gone, in some of my faith searching, I had gone to other Christian groups on campus, and I had felt like when I walked in the door, it was sort of like a Christian dating service. I don't know if you've ever heard the term evangel dating, but I sort of felt like I'm going here to find a guy, and maybe some of these guys are going to find a girl. And University Christian Outreach was different. It was not like that, and I noticed that right away. So because of that group, I really was able to sort of backpedal some of the ways that I had been relating to the opposite sex and really examine and look at the things that I'd been doing badly. So I just want to share with you some of those things that I learned from my time in University Christian Outreach. I was in the group, and then I actually worked on staff for a while after I graduated, and they were a great help in helping me kind of untangle the emotional mess that I had put myself in relating to members of the opposite sex. So I just have a couple of practical things that I learned during my time. As I said, I also want you to know that if you are like me and you have maybe not done this area of your life in the best way, or have maybe not put up the most healthy boundaries, there is great hope, because I think that I am kind of the poster child for doing it badly and putting myself into a lot of situations where I got really emotionally attached to some men that I shouldn't have. And the Lord has really healed me, and I have a great man in my life now, my husband, obviously, who the Lord really brought into my life and brought a lot of healing through. So I want you to have great hope if you feel like you have not done this well, because I did not do this well, and I have a happy ending at the end of it. So a couple practical points about opposite sex friendships. One of the most important things that I came to learn in my time in this group is that it's very, very important when you're single especially to spend time investing in friendships with the same sex. The reason I say that, and the reason that I learned that, was this. When you get married, your friendships with members of the opposite sex will and should change, right? So you can't have the opposite sex, best friend who you're calling on the phone at night and asking, hey, what do you think about this thing? Or did you hear this thing? It's not appropriate, right? Especially when you're married. So it's a very important thing to really invest in those friendships now, because you're only going to marry one person of the opposite sex. And the friends that you have that are the same sex, you will carry the rest of your life. But the friendships you have with people that are the opposite sex, they can be there, they'll look different, but they can't be the same way that they were before. And I have an example of that I can share. I told my husband I was going to share this, and he said it was okay. So my husband had a female friend in college who was a great friend and is a great friend. And when we started dating, actually, and even when we were engaged, it was a little bit of a struggle because they had relied on each other pretty heavily. They were like very, very close friends. They thought of each other, on paper at least, as brother and sister. At least my husband did. But it got to the point where this female friend, even when we were engaged, was still calling him and asking him for his advice on things, and in a way that was, I didn't in any way doubt my husband's loyalty to me or anything like that, but it got to the point where it was inappropriate, because I said to my husband, I know that there's no funny business or anything going on here, but when we get married, you can't have this type of a friendship with her anymore. It's not appropriate, and it's not loving to her either, and the man that she ends up with. And so we talked it through, we prayed together about it, and what we decided is that she and I, or my husband and I, were going to be joint friends with her. And so, and she's a wonderful person, and I've come to view her as a great friend in my own life, actually. So we kind of, I would say, sort of redeemed the parts of that were a little unhealthy by saying, okay, instead of just having her call my husband and ask for advice, now my husband and I will call her together to see how she's doing. She's single. She's going through some awful, you can pray for her. Her name's Nicole. She's searching for truth. But it's become one of those situations that the Lord has really redeemed, and it could have been a lot worse. But God can take situations that are sometimes difficult and do those sorts of things. So that's one practical thing. Another thing I would say is it's really helpful, I think, to fall into a mindset when you're thinking of being friends with someone of the opposite sex, to ask yourself these questions of, how can I conduct myself in this friendship so I can stay friends with them when they date or marry someone else, because they probably will, right? So one of the great blessings that I have from this group that I was in is I have some really, really great male friends that I made in this group who are now married to some of my best friends. And we're friends still. And there was, because of some of the ways that we learned to relate with each other in a healthy way, there was no emotional baggage, so that when they married my best friend, it was like, I can't, go to your house anymore because I know too much about, your deepest, darkest secrets about X thing. And so I really think it's important to kind of have that in mind. The friends that you have that are the opposite sex, as wonderful as they are, chances are you probably will not end up marrying that friend, right? And so how can you keep that friendship in a way that when they marry someone else, when you marry someone else, you can still have a healthy boundary there. The other thing, too, I think, just in terms of friendship, and I think this is especially important for women, be very careful to not allow yourself to be emotionally reliant on someone of the opposite sex, right? So especially for women who are more emotionally driven, probably calling your guy friend and asking his advice on ABC guy that just broke your heart, probably not the most helpful thing. Asking him to be an emotional support for you when you could have a female do that for you, female friend, is something that's probably not the best, either for you or for him. And I actually have done that badly myself in the past. I had a friend that I had right after college who I didn't follow my own advice in this way, to be honest with you. I had gone through a heartbreak, and this particular guy actually was, in my mind, discerning the priesthood. And so I thought, he'll be nice and safe. I can go and talk to him, and it'll be okay. He can listen to all my deepest, darkest secrets and pain about blah, blah, blah guy that broke my heart. And what ended up happening was that he came to me and said, this is like really not helpful in my discernment, and I feel like, I've developed these pretty strong feelings for you because, I want to like help you and fix you. And I think sometimes for men, they want to fix it and they want to make it better. For women, we want to lay our deepest, darkest secrets out. So it was not helpful for me or for him, and we had to take a step back and say, this is not a good situation. So please don't do what I did. And then just the last piece about the dating part that I think is a very good piece of advice is avoid being one-on-one with any member of the opposite sex after a certain time in the evening. You've all heard that adage, nothing good ever happens after midnight. I think it's midnight, or add in whatever time you want to add in. Boundaries come down even with the most, with the best intentions and the holiest people. People get tired, alcohol gets involved, things come out. Just in your friendships with members of the opposite sex, just set a boundary for yourself that, I'm not going to be one-on-one with this person after this time. That I think will be a great help. So the other thing so actually those were more, I misspoke earlier, those are more kind of friendship boundaries. I think in terms of dating boundaries for members of the opposite sex, I think it's really helpful to think first and foremost of every person that you date as a brother or sister in Christ, and not as a potential somebody that you're going to marry. And I know for myself, when I changed my mindset in that way, it really changed how I approached dating some of the men that I dated before I met my husband. Chances are the person that you date is not the person you're going to marry. I discerned religious life and then had to spend 10 years waiting to meet my husband. And I went on dates with a lot of different men that ended up not being my husband. And so I did that sometimes okay, sometimes really badly. But I think it's the best thing that you can do is think about how can I guard this person's heart? How can I guard this person's purity for their future spouse? because it's probably likely not going to be me. And if it is going to be me, then I'm guarding them for myself, which is great too. So the other thing is I think it's really important to avoid jumping in too deeply too quickly to getting to know somebody of the opposite sex when you're dating. And what I mean by that, Michelle kind of spoke a little bit to that, but an example, I had a man that I was dating before I met my husband, and I had only been on one date with him, and he called me after that date, and he wanted to have these very, very long, very deep emotional conversations over the phone about my deepest, desires and hopes for the future and all of these sorts of things. And for myself, I realized pretty quickly, like, this is not somebody that I see myself, like, ending up with. And so I prayed about it, and I had to go to him and say, you know what, I think it's probably not helpful for us to continue to, like, have these deep conversations. And I'm saying this to you because you're my brother, and I don't want you to get attached to me because I just don't think this is probably going to go anywhere. And to be honest with you, he was not happy to hear that. He was upset. That's not the way that most people conduct dating relationships in our world. And, he, like I said, he was upset with me. I hope one day in heaven he'll understand and know why I did what I did. But I think it's important to keep that in mind. Now, that being said, if you feel like the Lord is calling you to a particular person and discerning that person, then yeah, it's okay to talk about more emotional things. The kind of clicker for me was I knew that guy was not going to be, somebody that I wanted to continue to invest in. So if you know that, do the other person a favor as their brother or sister and leave out the deep emotional conversations. And then the very last thing that I think is really important that affected me and also I was affected by was really before you jump into dating. I think it sounds like it's probably a common sense thing to think about, but I think a lot of people, even in our good Catholic circles, don't think about this. Are you actually really ready to get married? Or do you just want to date? So if you are in a place where you just want to date and you just want the companionship of having someone else that likes you, that you can hold hands with, blah, 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 you're setting yourself up to hurt not only yourself but also them. Emotionally, you're setting yourself up potentially to fall into physical sin. You're just putting yourself and them in a situation that's not good. If you are at a point where you're ready to get married, then you can prayerfully discern each person as somebody that's a potential spouse, knowing that you're in the right headspace and place to do that. And I know that there are sometimes different views about this in our circles, but I personally think as someone that also has discerned religious life, if you have any thought that you are potentially discerning anything to do with religious life and being single, do not date someone until you have gone through that with the Lord. I have had that done to me, and I'm sure that I have done that to other people. It's not fair to somebody, right? So I think it all comes down to really thinking about that other person as your brother and sister in Christ and honoring them in that way. And you want at the end of the day to be able to look at someone else and have them marry someone else and think, I can still be friends with that person and their spouse with how I conducted myself while I was either their friend while I was single or while we were dating. And I think that's the aim that we should all have. So that's it.
It's so funny, like the themes that are running through these talks, like last week or the week before, I mentioned that prayer of as we're single and if we're frustrated, to pray to see our women, to see men as our brothers in Christ, not as seeing them with eyes of the Lord and not with eyes of lust. And you kind of said like the exact same thing, so on the same page.
Must be the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and then our couple last week mentioned actually a lot of what you had said about the friendships, and just that was like a ton of great insight. We will have you guys talk at your small groups, but we're gonna have you do that after we hear from the Woodsums. So welcome Cristin and John Woodsum to their talk.
Thanks for having us. So the Krogmeyers and the Giordanos are close friends, so it's important that we outdo them tonight. So give us thumbs up, thumbs down if we're heading in the right or wrong direction. But hey, thanks, Michelle and Elizabeth. That was really good, really strong stuff. So thanks for sharing that. So Cristin and I have been married for 14 years.
Last time we were talking about it, he got the number wrong. I had to do the quick math. 2004, it's 2018.
We've been Our Lady of Good Counsel for 6 years. We have 7 children. That one I nailed. 7 children. We live in Northville. Any Mustangs out there? All right. Go Stangs. Kristin's a Hillsdale Charger. I'm a Michigan Wolverine. Go Blue. So that's a little bit about us. So we've actually never been in conflict with one another in these 14 years we've been together. We actually dated for a year. Actually, we probably had the least amount of conflict in that year. No, actually, we're really good at conflict resolution because we do it 2 or 3 times a day. So yeah, no, very much appreciate this opportunity. We have done not a ton of preparation, but do have a few similar maybe to what Elizabeth prepared, just a few kind of practical tips and maybe some anecdotes from what we've gone through a little bit. So, Cristin, you want to take it away?
So, John and I are very passionate people, which is good because it means 7 kids, right?
Right on.
Shine a lamp on it. But also, like, we fight pretty passionately too. We have conflict. Pretty passionately. We're both stubborn, to put it mildly. So we decided what we would tell other people who aren't married, and what we put into practice, but it's like such a hard discipline to break those bad habits that we've been doing for a lot of years. But one of the best things that you can do to resolve a conflict is to not get into one in the first place. And I don't say that, I don't mean that trivially. What I mean is, like, you need to grow in trust with your spouse and make sure that you need to feel confident that they have your best interests in mind. So what does that mean? What does that look like? It means you guys pray together daily. And I'm not talking about grace before meals, although that's a given. But then also pray together during the day. Pray for each other throughout the day. Also participate in the sacraments. I know not everybody here is Catholic, but it's there's a lot of graces in going to Mass, obviously on Sundays. If you can make it during the week, that's even better. Regular confession. When I know that, like, John and I, we take our sacraments really seriously, so it helps us just trust, like, okay, we're on the same page, you know? We're trying to do this. We're trying to get each other to heaven. And so it just creates an atmosphere of trust and love. You do the small things, and the larger conflicts, you realize it's just a different perspective. So that's it. Talk's over.
Focus on the sacrament.
Just don't get into conflict.
Right. So actually, this next subject has a lot to do with what Elizabeth shared, and it's about being part of a supportive community. So just a question. So in your experience, is the society, is like your normal day-to-day, the community that you live and work in, generally like supportive of a strong Catholic or a strong Christian, like, couplehood? Yeah, no. Like, raise your hands. There would be 0 hands. Like, turn on the radio. No. Turn on. Oh, you've got one. Great. That's good. Good for you.
I work at the seminary.
Okay. Awesome. That's awesome. That's great.
Oh, we all feel much better knowing that that's how you feel.
Exactly. That's a good thing. Yeah, but I mean, one of the things we found as parents, watch a football game with your kids and you're constantly trying to change the channel during the commercials. I mean, there's just, our society is so not supportive of what it is so many of us are trying to do. And so the way that the evil one works, of course, is a couple will be trying to do the right thing, trying to, if you're really off to a great start, you're doing what Cristin already just shared, and you're living a prayerful life, and you're receiving the sacraments, but there still will inevitably be cracks, and the cracks will form, conflicts will form. And what the evil one, of course, is trying to do is to drive a wedge in that and make those cracks bigger and not allow you to grow together. And so as you walk out of that, potential argument, as you drop your girlfriend or boyfriend off on a date, or as you walk into work and share your story at the water cooler, or flip on the TV and get seduced by some stupid, advertisement or whatever, that's, there's very much, the evil one is always there to try to drive a wedge in that crack. And so you just need to be really deliberate about that. So that speaks to friendships. And so the folks that you're hanging out with outside of work, or any of, the folks that you're spending time with, and just simply how you spend your time and what you expose yourself to, you just have to ask yourself, is this in my best interest? Not only with me as a man and trying to do God's will in my life, but is this conversation I'm having with this jerk at the water cooler helpful to me in what I'm trying to do with Cristin, whether it's while we were dating, whether it's while we were married. And I think in a particular way as guys, there are like some big decisions there. So, certainly the guys I hung out with in college for the 5 years, one extra that I was in Ann Arbor, are not all the same guys that would have been supporting me as Cristin and I were dating, and certainly now in our marriage. So, and I'm sure that's true of women as well, but I just know from my own perspective, there are some decisions there where you just kind of have to ask yourself, hey, Jake's a super good guy to hang out with, and I'd love to watch football with him, but that has probably run its course at this point in my life, or where it is that we're trying to head together. So I think you just have to ask yourself some of those hard questions and be ready to make some decisions like that. I don't know. Is there an equivalent female perspective on that?
For me, no.
Yeah.
I've always been kind of deliberate about the company that I keep. I make other mistakes in other areas.
Yeah. All right.
So.
Well, you can move on to the next thing.
So we all hear it culturally. We say that if, in order for a marriage to succeed, that you give each person a 50-50. What you may or may not know, that in a Catholic marriage, each person is supposed to, is a covenant. So it's not signing a piece of paper, it is giving all of yourself to your spouse. And that sounds super nice, when you're having sex, but quite frankly, it's more than that. So that's the bonus part of giving yourself to another person. Sorry, John and I talk about sex with the newly engaged, so that just kind of flows off my mind. Anyway.
It's not that we're always there, just when we're in the parish house.
So anyway, okay, sex. That's where it was. No, but it also flows in. You have to give of yourself always, when you're in conflict. So, it's not fun, because I know a lot of times when John and I are in conflict, I want to stand my ground and not move, because I'm self-righteous, quite frankly. But yes, in entering into a covenant, you do have to give all of yourself. And so one of the readings John and I had at our wedding was from Ephesians 5. And I know that you guys are probably familiar with this one. Sometimes in some circles it's a little bit controversial. We can give a talk about the whole submission thing another time. But it says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church." Have you looked at a crucifix recently? Does that look fun? It's not. But that's what we're called to do. And a lot of times you get in seasons of life. I know Elizabeth is learning about love in a different way, with how she has to give to a baby at all hours with unpredictability. And that's learning about a different type of sacrificial love. But that's what we're called to, giving of ourselves. And a lot of times I know, with John, we're thinking about different specific conflicts. There's one conflict that on paper we encountered twice, but there are very different outcomes. So John, for work, had an opportunity to move to Connecticut, move our family to Connecticut. I was pregnant with our fourth. Our oldest was just 4 years old. And I knew that it was really important for John's career, and that had been modeled a lot. I moved around a lot when I was a little girl. And so I was like, you know what, John? We're leaving my family, we're leaving your family, but like, I trust you, I love you, let's do this. Then we moved back to here, and just a few years ago, John had another job opportunity where we could move to Pennsylvania. And it was, on paper, everything looked great, and I didn't want to tell him no, but gosh, I didn't want to say yes either. And we had just had our sixth baby at the time, and we were really involved in the parish. Our kids are at a great school that really is an awesome faith community for both John and I and for our children. And I just could not imagine moving, but I didn't want to say no. So we took it to prayer, and just one day, completely randomly, John's like, Cristin, we can't leave our parish and school. And that was him dying of self to me and the family, because he knew that if we moved, he would be going to work and doing his thing, but I would be left trying to replicate something that we had here.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, good. So the next piece is about feeling, trying to focus, so in conflict, again, try to set the context here. So we're talking about conflict. We've talked about how to avoid conflict. We've talked about how to not let like the evil one take conflict and really rip you apart. So by surrounding yourself with good community, Cristin's talked about like how you need to be willing to, the mindset should not be to try to meet 50-50, because inevitably you're going to fall, there's going to be a gap there. You're going to feel like you get 50 and the other person's only going 1. So to try to be willing to yourself to go all the way yourself, just to ensure that there is in fact an overlap. And then this next piece then is about, again, like in the mindset of now that you're actually in a conflict, the idea is that you want to try not to focus on who did what, when, how, where, like the specifics of how this conflict arose. And instead try to focus on the feelings that are happening inside of you that the conflict has driven. So here's why that's important, because if I hurt Cristin and she says, hey, you you are so selfish. When we left my parents' house at 6 o'clock, you said you'd be home by 7:30 to have a beer with the guys, but you came home at 9:30. You must have had 6 beers. You were drunk. I didn't know where you were. You drove home wasted. You put our whole family in jeopardy, and you're a selfish jerk. Like there's like 16 opportunities there for me to argue with her, because you know what? We didn't leave my parents' house until 6:15 actually, and I told you I'd be home at 8. Actually, I was home at 8:15. I had 2 beers. I'm not drunk, and like chill the heck out. And then like away we go, because we're focused on on what I did or didn't do, and then there's all kinds of things to argue about. But if Cristin were to approach that completely differently, the way that Cristin normally would approach something like that, and say something like, oh my gosh, John, you had me scared. I was really fearful. I thought you were going to be home by 8. You were home by 8:30. Then I think about you drinking and driving, the kids, and I think about in the future, I'm going away next weekend, and I think about... I got fearful, and then and then when you walked in the door, that fear turned to anger, and like, geez, please, like, don't make me feel scared. I want to feel safe in you and in our relationship. That just elicits such a different response. Of course, I don't want Cristin to feel scared, and of course, by staying out 15 minutes later, like, would I trade those 15 minutes with the guys, for knowing that my wife was literally like scared for my well-being and scared for the well-being of my family? It's a totally different response. So it's very hard to argue with people's feelings. It's really easy to argue with like the accusations of exactly what happened and what time and what the quantities were and so on and so forth. And I think that that's pretty universal in conflict. If you talk about like what's going on inside of you, then it's a really hard thing to like, I'm not going to argue about whether or not Cristin felt scared. Geez, that's not something I want you to feel. And so really, and this is kind of like conflict resolution 101 that you'll see in any kind of a marriage prep or any type of relationship prep, but you try to avoid like the you starting statements and try to start with the I feel starting statements. But I feel like that maybe that example will help that out a little bit more, because at least in our experience, those exercises and what seem to be like a little cheesy. Like, of course we're going to talk about what happened, but we certainly, as our marriage has gone on, we feel like there's a lot there, and that's actually really good advice. You want to talk a little bit about? I guess I'm talking about communication. So this is so this next piece, of course, as well. If you read anything about conflict resolution, you're going to talk about communication, whether that's in a professional environment or certainly in the environment of a relationship. And so I think for us, certainly, like getting into a place where you can listen is really, really important. Of course, again, that's not unique to a marital relationship or a dating relationship, but it's not necessarily always an easy thing to do. So first and foremost, I'm just going to kind of give 3 practical tips. So first and foremost, if you're going to fight, like get into a time and place that makes sense to fight. Get into a time and place that makes sense to have a conversation. Don't try to do it, like in our case, too often we try to like just slip in a little conflict resolution during dinner time. And it's like, seriously, like you're bringing that up now? Like, inappropriate. Or just I'm just going to slip in the fact that I've got to go away for 10 days, like when I walk in the door, like on our way out to a conflict resolution class, or, it's just, so you have to be a little more thoughtful about, okay, we're going to address this issue. I have the social sense to know that this is going to be a challenging issue. So let's make sure that we set aside some time, that we have some quiet, that we're not watching the game, or that we turn the radio off and whatever. So just to set a time and place to have the conversation is an important start. Second thing, you can't listen if you are thinking about your like super clever response. And so if you find yourself, Cristin is talking to me and I'm like, oh, sweet, I'm going to nail her on that. Like that's not listening. You're not listening at all. You're just like trying to like basically build your case. Oftentimes it's called like you're listening with your motor running. And so, obviously you can kind of self-check against that, but as well, when you can check you can check the person you're in conflict with if they just simply don't respond to what you said. If you stop talking and they just say, great, boom, my turn, and shoot off like a rocket, like they didn't listen to you. And oftentimes it's easy to say like, hey, do you want to respond to what I said, or are you just doing your own thing here? And so then that dovetails then into the third tip, which is often described as like active listening, which sounds something like this, and it probably isn't new, but it's I think a practical tip that's helpful, or we think it's a practical tip that's helpful. So you're in a conflict with somebody, and they rattle off their thing, and hopefully it's not 20 minutes worth of a soliloquy. Hopefully it's like a minute of like, yeah, they hit you hard. Hopefully it wouldn't be anything like that. And so the idea here is that in active listening, you would say to this person in return, you'd say, okay. Is it Cristin? Okay, Cristin, like, Kirsten? Okay, Kirsten, like, what I heard you say is, like, the summary, my takeaway from what you just said to me is, X, Y, and Z. Is that what all of that, was that all supposed to be packaged up to tell me these 3 things? And oftentimes, especially like if you're in the heat of the moment, Kirsten will be like, no, let me tell you that again, son, and go back at you. But the idea is if you can agree that, okay, that's what I'm supposed to get. I'm supposed to get X, Y, and Z. Then at that point, then I can make my counter argument and try to address that stuff. Oftentimes, you'll find, and then if you do the same to me, okay, what I heard you say back is this. Is that your point? Is that really what? You might say something like, "Is that really the leg you're going to choose to stand on, bro?" And if it is, I can say like, "Yeah, I think that's legitimate." And then now we can talk about like something much, much smaller that we actually care about as opposed to the details. And oftentimes I think when people are good at arguing, you can go back and forth and do that. It's obviously easier in a professional sense because, or in a professional environment, because hopefully you know that no one's going to get up and flip the table over, or your relationship's not at risk. But that kind of active listening, that verbal confirmation back and forth is, I think, really helpful. And then third, that then dovetails, if you find yourself in a situation where it's just too hot, it's just too heated to do that, oftentimes the very best thing you can do is just separate and write. No one's going to interrupt you while you're writing. Let's just, let's just take a break here. Let's just write this stuff down. We can exchange letters, and then we can ask ourselves, like, hey, like, can we do this without interrupting each other? But writing, and as silly as it sounds, Chris and I have often found like just separating rooms and like we'll just like start texting each other. And like as childish as that sounds, but going back and forth via text, like at least you can just like look at the argument and say, okay.
Except when you're writing and there's a dot.
Exactly. I mean, there a lot of people and a lot of coaches will talk about like letter writing and having a certain letter writing technique. We have not personally like been disciplined enough and probably patient enough to do that. But again, as lame as it sounds, just separating and getting it down in writing will allow you to articulate your thoughts in a more coherent, logical way. You get to see it before you hit the send button. We find that's helpful when we actually really when things really get cranked up. So those are some more practical tips.
Still trying to figure out if John just dropped a 10-day trip bomb.
No, I didn't. I'm going to talk about that on the way home.
Right. So one of these, one helpful thing that I found when I was actually looking at like a parenting something or other article that I read was...
this is our last piece,
it's
our last.
How to apologize. And it's a 4-part apology. And we tell our kids it's like the 4-part apology, or I use the broken plate analogy. So imagine John is unloading the dishwasher. And he picks up a plate, or he doesn't want to unload the dishwasher because he'd rather watch football, but I'm getting on him, so he decides, okay, I'll unload the dishwasher right now. So he opens the dishwasher and he's complaining and he's putting plates away and he breaks a plate. And like one of my favorite plates. And so rarely ever is it about the broken plate. It's about, that was my mom's, you were throwing it, you were being, inattentive as you were dealing with this. So the apology, we like to say, it's a 4-part apology. So it's, I'm sorry for breaking your plate. Okay? The next part is, it was wrong because I wasn't being careful. In the future, I will be more careful when unloading the dishwasher and dealing with the plate. Will you please forgive me? Now that's an important aspect. It's not, I'm sorry. It's asking for forgiveness. So it's humility. The person who made the offense is saying, I'm sorry, I know what I did, I know why it was wrong, I know how to avoid doing it in the future, and I'm sitting here asking if you'll forgive me and move forward. So then that puts the onus on the other person, and if you make a decision to forgive the person, I will be honest, like there are times where I'm like, yes I will, but not right now, because it's not about like a plate, but something a little bit more I'm sensitive to, because I want my forgiveness to be authentic. I don't want to just say it but still be upset about it. So sometimes I will say, I will forgive you, but I need some time. But anyway, so the 4-part apology, I'm sorry for, it was wrong because, in the future I will you please forgive me? So that's all done. Forgiveness has been granted, but guess what? There's a broken plate on the floor still. So it's great that we've mended our ways, but there's still a mess. And as with a lot of conflicts, that's the case. You've asked for forgiveness, you've been given forgiveness, but there's still some mess that needs to be cleared up. So that's a helpful visual with our kids and that we use within our marriage as well.
Yeah, that's right. And this is our last point. I think the only thing I would emphasize on that is that oftentimes, and again, I think it's particularly from the male perspective, we can be proud of ourselves or feel, we can feel like we've been humble if we just utter the 2 words or the 2 words, I'm sorry, or I am sorry. That's 3. I did all that math just now, right now, right on the fly. But that really, as opposed to that 4th part of will you please forgive me, the I'm sorry is it's a self-centered statement. You're making a statement. It's got nothing to do with the other person. I, the man, am this. I'm sorry. I'm also, taller than you. Neither one of those things are particularly impressive. But to say the other-centered question and really put it in your court, like, Kirsten, this is now in your court. Like, we're not moving forward until it's your decision now. I'm sorry. Will you please forgive me? Is a much more like humbling, vulnerable thing that's a lot harder, at least in my perspective, it's a lot harder to do than just like uttering the words. And so I think, in a particular way as guys, that's an important piece. And that's what we had prepared. So hopefully that was helpful.